Welcome to our podcast, Raising Bigs. This podcast is an ongoing conversation between myself and my young adult son. We're ready and willing to talk about all the things families might experience in their lives and relationships, both as parents and young adults, from teens to 20 somethings, the good, the bad, and the ugly. In this episode, we're talking about disagreements and apologies. It's unrealistic to expect raising bigs won't come with some disagreements. The whole job of a young adult is to establish their own identity and take agency over their own life, separate from the one they have within their parents' home. Recognizing and handling disagreements in a constructive manner is key to preserving respect in the relationship between parents and bigs. When things get heated and you disagree, taking your space and then apologizing from a place of authenticity can ensure lines of communication stay open and no one walks away feeling disregarded, unvalued, or unloved. Let's dive into the discussion. I'm Mercy and I'm the mom.
I'm Cade and I'm her kid. Most people don't enjoy conflict, but hopefully those that do can find a constructive outlet to get that need met. Conflict is bound to happen in any relationship, whether it is a parent and child, two parents, a relationship, siblings, friends, anything like that. Disagreements and conflicts are bound to happen, but when there's no circling back for closure on the issue and the true problem never gets solved, some resentment can build up over time. It's like a kettle wanting to boil. Apologizing is a powerful resource that can be used to calm the waters, even if you aren't sure if you're on the right side of the issue. There doesn't necessarily need to be your right or wrong. Sometimes an apology is just a good way to get closure on the argument and the disagreement. Mom, what does it feel like when you have a disagreement with one of your bigs, coming from that parent-child perspective? What does that feel like for you?
Yeah, to be really in a disagreement and what a disagreement means to me is not just a little, it's not just a little thing, right? Like you left your dirty dishes in the sink. Like a disagreement to me is where it has escalated. There, two people, two opinions, right? You and your child. Your child's opinion does not match yours, as it won't because they are not you. But you end up clashing, right? So there is a clash over what you both think about a topic, what you both think should happen, what you think someone's next move should be, how you think you're being parented. Any of that can result in a disagreement. And as a parent, it can feel really disheartening because the last thing you want to do, unless you're a control freak, the last thing you want to do is like be in disagreement with your child and have hard feelings towards your child, which that's a really hard thing to expect because you feel like you're
Mhm.
just supposed to love them all the time and be there for them. But also you have to kind of develop a thick skin sometimes when you're a parent and realize that your child is supposed to have some strong opinions about you and to not agree with you. That's part of what allows them to fly on their own, right? Is to be
Mhm.
able to do that. But it's hard as a parent to put yourself in a situation where you feel strongly about something, but your kid is pushing back, right, against you. And so there's part of your instinct that tells you that, oh, no, I need to make them understand my way because I think my way might be the right way. Or there's part of you that thinks, oh, I really want my child to feel like I value their opinion. So it can be a really hard push and pull. There's like a
Mhm.
dichotomy of being the parent on that side. You don't want to do or say things that hurt your child's feelings, but sometimes kiddos need to be, put in check a little bit. And so that's a hard balance to take. And I know, disagreements did not happen extremely often in our house when you guys were growing up, but when they did, they were hard for me and would cause me lost sleep. Like if we disagreed with something before bedtime, that's not always the most constructive time to have discussions.
Mhm.
But I would sit and stew about it all night. Now, part of that is my personality, right? Some parents are just able to brush that off. Oh, whatever, my kid doesn't agree with me. But that wasn't my experience. My experience was that I would lose sleep over a disagreement with my child, or it is something that would cause me to not be able to focus at work or to be sad because my child and I are in disagreement. So that's what I experienced it or still do. You guys are still big, still growing, still young adults. And I know even fully grown adult children have disagreements with their parents, and it becomes a little bit of a different dynamic as the kids become older. That's subject for another podcast. But with raising bigs, I think, there definitely is the ability to kind of be knocked off your game as a parent when there's a
Mhm.
disagreement going on with your child. So, Kate, what are the feelings that come up for you when you're in a disagreement with one of your parents?
For sure. I think, like you said, it definitely depends on the personality of everyone involved. Because obviously, there's some people who can just brush it off and be fine. There's other people who, sit and linger. There's other people who like to take some time to themselves and think about it and then come back. There's people who like to just address it in the moment. But I know for me, at least, it kind of like you said, it's just that good, it's that not good feeling of feeling like you're, at odds with your parent. And especially when you're growing up, you need them for so much, whether it's you're asking them for advice or asking them for a ride or asking them for whatever. So I think sometimes that disagreement can then create more tension and even more of a problem. Because, if we disagreed on something silly like, what time I can come home on a Friday night, whatever, if we disagreed that on Friday night and then Saturday something major happens in my life and I need to come and talk to you about it, I think me and you personally have that relationship where we can kind of put the problem to the side and, whatever I needed help with, you would help me. But I think that there is a lot of parent child relationships where that conflict can kind of just put that extra stress on the relationship um, until it is solved. So it's definitely not a good feeling. It feels bad. It feels like you're at odds with them. You want to be at peace with them and have everybody be on the same page. Obviously, that's not always realistic, but that's the way it feels for me at least.
Yeah, so let's kind of talk about if there is a disagreement, right? What helps us to move past that disagreement and then be ready to kind of reconnect with each other? So I know one of the things that we got really good at as a family was to just take space, like to not stay in a heated disagreement if anyone was to the point where they were feeling physically or emotionally uncomfortable, right? Being
Hmm.
able to say, you know what, I need some space or I need some time. Like sometimes you just need time to process what the other person's saying in order to get to the other side. So do you feel space and time help you, Cade, when in disagreement with a parent? And then what do you do with that space and time? Like
Uh-huh.
what are you doing when you're taking that
Yeah.
space and time?
For me, and I think this is, with parents and all other relationships or friendships, whatever it may be, I'm really the kind of person that likes to solve the problem in the moment. So, even if, we're having a disagreement and, things are getting heated or we're not seeing each other's point of view, me personally, I like to, maybe take like 5 minutes and just cool off for a second and then come back. But I find for me, if I go and don't talk to you for a day or two, it just kind of builds up in my mind. I think about what I did say, what I could have said, what you shouldn't have said, what I how you made me feel. And at least for me, I don't think it helps me process my emotions at all. What helps me process them is having the conversation and explaining,
Mhm.
depending on what the disagreement was, you said this and that hurt me and I didn't like that you did this or whatever, and getting those out. But I do think that space and time can be beneficial for several reasons, kind of like I mentioned earlier, to be able to take just a minute or two to cool off. And, you're in the heat of the moment. And sometimes you're not hearing what the other person is saying or you're not
Mhm.
fully understanding it. And also, even longer periods of time, that could be beneficial to, you might think of something, once you're out of that, heated moment, you might think, okay, I actually do see, what their point is coming from. So I think it's important, both as a child and as a parent, to recognize your the opposite person's,
Mhm.
conflict style. Are they a person who just likes to get in and, have the conflict and dive in head first and then get to a resolution, or do they need time to think about it? And I think that sometimes is the root of a lot of problems in
Mhm.
disagreements is you don't know how the other person handles disagreements. So if I'm a person that likes to, deal with things in the moment, but you're a person that needs time and space to yourself, and I'm trying to force you to have the conversation and get through it right now, obviously that's not gonna help. But on the other hand, it's also not fair to me to then I just have to sit and wait for 3 days until you're, ready to talk about it, and not saying us specifically in that situation, but just using the two of us as an example. So I think there's kind of that middle ground that you can come to and figure out what works best for you, and kind of like you brought up, considering your approach in that and how you re-bring up the conversation. I also think that it's a good idea, if you are taking time apart, to set a time for when you're going to bring it back up. I think sometimes it's easy in the moment to be like, okay, well, we'll just talk about this later, blah, blah, blah. And then sometimes later never comes. Or later comes 2 weeks from now and you've already moved on from it and, whatever. So I think that's important to say, hey, and it's hard to do when you're in the moment, it's a lot easier said than done, but to recognize, you're having that disagreement, things aren't, going well, and say, listen, obviously, we're not saying eye to eye. Nothing's going to change here tonight, but let's, take the night for ourselves and then let's reconnect tomorrow morning, or let's
Mhm.
reconnect, tomorrow night, or whenever it works in your guys' schedule. I think that that's a good plan. But what about you?
Yeah, I'm with you. I like to get in there and solve the problem. I don't like to carry it forward, but we do have members in our family who like to take a little bit more time to think about what their reaction and their approach is. And so I think we need to honor that. And that can be as simple as asking someone when you notice and you're picking up on their vibe that they're getting physically or emotionally uncomfortable. Like if you are a problem solver who wants to get in and deal with it immediately, to say, hey, I see that this is really tough on you. Could we reconvene? And I love that you said
Uh-huh.
set a time, set a time, because it's not fair to you either if that person needs time to think, but you want to solve it in the moment, to just say, okay, we'll talk later. And then, like you
Uh-huh.
said, later never happens. And one of you might recover from the disagreement and it might not be an issue for you. But for the other person, they've been sitting and stewing for 3 days, like
Yep.
you said. So I think allowing people that space and time for reflection, or if things get to the point where you're just not hearing each other, taking that space and time to reflect on what you've heard, what you've said, where things have kind of gone off the rails, and then consider how you're going to approach that person. When you live with people in the same house, ideally you have learned over time what works best as far as approach for one person versus another, and you employ that approach, because how you talk to your dad might not be the same way that you talk to your mom. And so, same thing as we've said a million times, right? Every kid is different, every parent is also different. So,
Hmm.
I think it's important to realize that sometimes we do need that time and space, and that coming back, right? Circling back to that disagreement is important. So when we're ready to revisit that disagreement, there's usually some things that need to be said or need to be done. What do you think those things might
Hmm.
be, Cade, that we need to do in order to get some closure around the disagreement?
For sure. I think it's important to, especially, once you've had that time to kind of think about what you're thinking, what the other person is thinking, take some time. And something that I've learned recently is try to explain how the other person is feeling from your perspective.
Mm,
So if you and I are in an argument, let's say about, you know, me dropping out of college, not just make up made up situation. If I'm hearing that, oh, you're so disappointed in me and you think that I'm gonna fail at life and blah blah blah. I can tell you, well, when we talked last night, I felt like you were just saying because I dropped out of college, I was never gonna be anything and I was, gonna fail at life and you were so disappointed in me and blah blah blah. And that opens up the opportunity for you to say, oh no, I didn't mean that you were, gonna fail at life and now you're, just nothing. I meant, are you sure, is that the right choice you want to make, or whatever you made. I've learned that recently, and I've put it into play several times over the past couple months, and it's actually been really beneficial because a lot of times what you're hearing isn't what the other person is
mm,
saying. And that could be because you're so upset in the moment that the other person isn't explaining, or they're coming across angrier than they are, or it could be that in the moment your emotions are so heightened that you
mhm.
don't fully understand what they're saying, and you might throw in extra words or things that you think they said that they really didn't. So that's, I think, at least for me, the start of kind of that reconnection. But what about for you? How do you think that conversation goes?
I love that idea that you brought up, Kate, just trying to re-express to them what how you felt around
Hmm.
what they said from their side of the conversation. Because it is important to find that clarity rather than, you're looking at things through your lens when they're saying them and could be misinterpreting them. So I love that idea. I think, just really understanding that respecting the other's viewpoint is super important. Everybody has a right to have their opinion. And I think that can really be a struggle as your kids are growing, because very often their opinions do not agree with yours. Like you can take the same gene pool and throw it together multiple times and you come out with very different versions.
Hmm.
They've all had very different experiences and they have very different value sets. And so it's not unusual for other people to have different opinions than you. And I think in a parent child situation, there can be this unspoken expectation that your kids are going to value what you value. They're going to agree with what you say. They're not going to have their own opinions because they were raised in your house, right?
Hmm.
Certainly, they are a direct product of everything that you tried to infuse into them over all these years. Wrong. That's not the way that happens. So, respecting each other's viewpoint, I think, is really important. And then I think the second step for me after kind of revisiting and clarifying, like I think some people think that this step shouldn't come till after everything's like completely closed,
Hmm.
but I think apologies up front are important. And so what does I'm sorry really mean? It doesn't have to mean I'm sorry for my opinion. It shouldn't mean that. It doesn't have to mean I'm sorry I spoke strongly about what I believe in, but it can mean I'm sorry that you're upset about this. I'm sorry that my disagreeing with you might cause you pain. I'm sorry that it's causing me pain, right? Like there can be a
Hmm.
lot of things that I'm sorry means, but it doesn't have to mean you're sorry that your opinions disagreed. But it can mean that you see that other person and you feel poorly about the discomfort, right? That has
Hmm.
come, or the disconnected feeling that has come from a disagreement. And maybe one or both of you showed up at the table and didn't handle things respectfully, or said things you wish you wouldn't have, or they said things that hurt your feelings. Like all of that can happen in the course of a disagreement. So, anything to add to what an apology might mean or what an I'm sorry means?
For
Okay.
sure. I think you said one thing that, I think is, you should never apologize for how you feel or what your opinion is or anything like that. You can apologize for, how you said it or the way that it made someone feel or, things like that. But it's important, you shouldn't apologize for, what you're thinking. Because at the end of the day, that's how you feel. That's your opinion. That's whatever. But it's also not fair to just say, okay, well, that's my opinion and you just have to deal with it. So I think that there's kind of that component of an apology there. And I also think apologizing for a specific thing is very important, or things if it's multiple in one argument. But sometimes I think some people just say I'm sorry and think that covers it up. But there's a difference between saying I'm sorry and saying I'm sorry that when I came and talked to you about this situation, I got so heated and I yelled at you and I blah blah, blah or whatever you're specifically apologizing for. I think that's something that's really important, and that's where that true meaning of the "I'm sorry" comes in, is you recognizing
Mhm.
what you're apologizing for. And again, kind of like the point I brought up earlier of clarifying how you perceive the situation, you might apologize for something that the other person didn't even need or want an apology for, or you might think, oh, I'm apologizing for blah blah blah, and the person say, oh, well, that's not why I'm upset. So I think that sometimes those apologies can bring clarification.
Yeah. And apologies are important for both sides of the relationship, right? Like, I think there is something very healing in providing an apology to another person, right? For
Hmm.
something that might have happened during the course of an argument or any other situation, right? And I know one thing that, you guys have thrown back at me multiple times that I've always said is it more important to be right, or is it more important to have peace? So
Hmm.
sometimes, and we'll talk a little bit more about that, but you get to the we have to agree to disagree, right? And I think, right now, when we look at all of the conflict entertainment that's in front of us, like everything that's spewed at us by social media, there's the balloons, the reactions from Apple. Uh, all of the entertainment that's going on is in the form of conflict, right? Whether you're watching the news or you're watching the reality shows or whatever, there's this constant push, right, for conflict. And so we become kind of numb to it sometimes. And I think it's important that number one, we're aware of that. And number two, that we try to balance that out and maybe not be using conflict as a source of entertainment for us.
Hmm.
Because if we become numb to it, then we really are in a mindset where we have to be right. And
Hmm.
if your whole purpose in showing up for a disagreement is to be right, like things are not going to work out well
Hmm.
if that
For
other
sure.
person has it. You can both be right, you can both be right in your own opinion, and you don't necessarily have to find an agreement or a compromise that works for you. That's not always possible. So
Mhm.
I am always shooting for peace overall, right? At the end of the day, sometimes that peace looks like removing yourself from the situation or from the relationship if you have
Mhm.
to, but that's a pretty drastic move to take. But approaching it from not always being right and apologizing if you are wrong. Like sometimes
Mhm.
there was a misunderstanding and you then turned around and did something um, that was wrong, or you
Mhm.
learned something about the other person's experience and now you realize you're wrong. Like owning that, stepping in and owning being wrong, I think is also really important. It shows your evolution as a person, and it just really opens things up with that other person when they're like, oh my gosh, like my mom realized that what I had to say maybe did have value and really sat and thought about it, and now it's coming
Mhm.
back to me and saying, you know what, I was wrong in what I said. So I think it's important to be able to to do that.
For sure. So after you get to, that place of, an apology, or, you find, who's right, who's wrong, or peace, or whatever, that kind of that conclusion is, how do you move beyond that disagreement and either, go back to how things were, or at least go back to a peaceful area where you guys can both coexist? I personally think it's natural for there to be a little bit of a little like uncomfortable feeling and a little bit there because you've just gotten an argument with someone, obviously depending on how extreme it is. But what do you do to kind of return, like I said, back to normal, or as close as you can?
Yeah, and I always think of at least getting to a neutral state, right? Where things are not
Mhm.
heated anymore. I hate the fakiness of, yeah, we just had this huge argument and yeah, we've apologized and we're still in recovery mode, right? So like immediately
Mhm.
going back to pretending, right, that everything is all fine and that nothing happened, like that feels really fake to me and is not where I want to exist while I'm healing, right? Because we need
Mhm.
some time and space in order to heal. So whether we've decided to revisit something later, sometimes that's the best way to move beyond is to say, you know what, can we check back in on this in a month or in a week or whatever the appropriate time frame is to come back together then and try to come to a conclusion if it's something that needs a conclusion. If you're needing closure, I think sometimes the closure is we've spent the time and engaged in the apology. Sometimes it has to look like healthy boundaries. So, a parent child relationship is a little bit different than relationships like you might have with a friend. Like, it's really easy to say, okay, this friend that I am in a friendship with is exhibiting some toxic behaviors, and I'm making a choice to no longer be involved with those toxic behaviors. I'm going to back off from that relationship, right? It's a little bit harder when it's family to do that, but also sometimes necessary in some pretty severe situations. But I think a healthy boundary of, really, you know what, as a big, right? I'm growing, I'm making some decisions. Maybe I'm going to choose someone else to talk to about situation XYZ who can give me the kind of support I need, not necessarily always agree
Mhm.
with me, but if there is something that caused a huge disagreement between you and your parent, maybe they're not the exact person, and so maybe there needs to be a boundary
For sure.
there, and you would prefer to talk to someone else about it in the future.
Yeah.
So I think those things are important. The agreement to revisit it later if you need to. Can you guys agree that you've come to some closure on this particular topic? And then installing healthy boundaries. And just a quick review for everyone what boundaries mean again. It's if you do this, then I will do this. It's not you trying to make someone else change. So Cade, if you walk in the room and you're really mad at me for ABC and you start screaming at me, I am going to remove myself from the
Mhm.
situation until you can approach me from a place of calm, right?
Mhm.
So that would be a healthy boundary example. So how about you, Cade? Like what do you think can help to move beyond that agreement and get you guys back to or get us back to a homeostatic place?
For sure. I mean, kind of agree with everything you said, but also just understanding that sometimes it takes time. And sometimes, you maybe have solved the problem, but those feelings are still fresh. Those feelings are still there. So, if you guys maybe aren't talking as much, or someone's a little more quieter, or they're, not
Mhm.
sharing certain parts of their life that they used to, or whatever it may be, I think it's important to understand that sometimes you just need that time to, kind of let things heal. And then I find that sometimes naturally you just almost, it's almost kind of like one day things just kind of click back into place,
Mhm.
whatever the situation may be. But eventually you just start going back to telling them, all the things you used to tell them, or whatever you stopped doing after that argument, or, if things got awkward and when you guys hung out, now all of a sudden the conversations were super short. Eventually, one day the conversations just go back to what they were. So I think that that's something is, sometimes it takes time. And there's been so many, disagreements, whether with me and you or friends, family, whoever, that you kind of think like the first day or two after the argument it's like, oh, like our relationship isn't going to be the same, and now things are different. And then a couple weeks later things are just back to normal, and you don't even realize that you had that disagreement. So I think sometimes that as long as all of those, like, everybody's apologized, everybody's done whatever they need to do, everybody has closure, I think eventually just with time you get to that point where you're able to kind of just move on and return back to normal.
And sometimes kind of the last piece that needs to happen is a forgiveness, and that extends to both sides, right? Sometimes you need to forgive yourself, for things you might have said, for a role you played, for a stance you took. Like sometimes
Mhm.
you need to forgive yourself, and then often you also need to forgive the other person. And forgiveness is a whole big topic on how that works and what that looks like. But just know that sometimes there is a forgiveness that needs to happen. And it doesn't mean you have to forget if there was some inciting incident, right, that caused the disagreement. Doesn't mean you have to forget what happened. But if you can move past forgiveness, you're really doing that. You are forgiving the other person for yourself. You are forgiving the other person. You are forgiving yourself for yourself. You can't move forward if you're not willing to forgive yourself and the other person if there's
For
been some
sure.
kind of a disagreement or altercation. So, Kate, what can parents do to make it easier on their big when a disagreement happens?
For sure. I think especially with, younger kids, up until teenage years and even into adulthood, as a parent, I personally feel like it is kind of your responsibility to kind of lead the way through that disagreement. So, whether that is you're the one that's initiating, kind of revisiting the topic, or you're the one that's initiating the apologies or whatever it is. I think that's important that sometimes, especially as your kids are developing, the disagreements that you have with your parents are what teaches you what disagreements should be like. So if you and your parent are having healthy disagreements where you're explaining your both your sides, and you're apologizing for whatever you need to apologize for, um, that then when you grow up into adulthood and you're in a relationship of your own, or you're at work and there's a conflict, or there's conflict with your friends or whatever, that can help teach you how to manage those. Versus if
Mhm.
you have a relationship with your parent that you guys fight and then just forget about it the next day and things go back to normal, or you hold on to that tension for weeks and weeks, then again, that teaches you later on in life that, if you have a disagreement with your partner or your friends or a colleague at work or whatever, you are just going to try to, leave it the way it is and just forget about it. And that's not it realistically a way that conflict works. So I think as a parent, taking on that role of being able to, lead that conversation through the disagreement can be beneficial both to one, your guys' relationship, but two, also to your child as they get older. It's a good learning
Mhm.
lesson. But what do you think about that? And then it's kind of the same question to you. What can, bigs do and kids do throughout that disagreement phase, whether it's during the disagreement or the apology phase, or what does that look like?
Yeah, I love that you use the modeling example, Cade. Like if they're leading through the discussion and leading through that process, it really is acting as a model so that then their big knows how to do that when they grow up. I love that idea.
Hmm.
I think what bigs can do to help ease the tension and kind of help that return to normal, quote unquote normal, right? If there is such a
Hmm.
thing in a family, I think being willing to um let your parent know that you understand that they're not perfect and that's okay.
Hmm.
I think society puts a lot of expectation of perfection on parents. And I
Hmm.
think a
For
lot
sure.
of times kids think their parents are perfect until they don't. And that can be a really, really tumultuous time and a hard time and a hard realization for kids to realize that their parents are human. So I think letting your parents know that, hey, I see you, I know this was hard for you too. And then maybe doing something simple like giving them a hug if you know
Hmm.
that's one of their love languages, or if you know their love language is acts of service and the garbage needs to be taken out. Go do it. They'll know you did it. They'll know the why behind it. It will not go unnoticed. So I think anything you can do to ease the tension for the parent, to let them know that you are okay, that your relationship with them is okay. Don't leave
Hmm.
anybody wondering. I think,
For sure.
that's really important because there's a lot of uncertainty at this phase in life for both bigs and their parents. And so I think there's a lot bigs can do to help alleviate that tension. Throw a joke at your parent, I mean, say
Hmm.
something you always say to them, just to kind of show that normalcy. And sometimes, and this goes for parents too, like even if you're still kind of hurting, like you said, and there's that space and that time to allow for healing, like throwing the other person a bone and I love you or whatever can go a long way to kind of shorten that
Hmm.
span of things feeling like they're done.
For sure.
So, we all need to approach disagreement from a place of love and acceptance. So your big is not you and you are not them. Everybody has a right to their own opinion, and disagreements are a natural part of life. So don't think there's anything wrong with your family. when there's disagreements that are happening. Opinions and disagreements need to be handled with respect, however. Also, thoughtfulness and honesty need to show up at the table as well if you expect the outcomes to be good. Don't let a disagreement derail your relationship with your parent or your big permanently. Life is too darn short, guys, to allow that to happen. So take the space and time that you need to heal and then come back together with an open heart. Sincere apologies are essential, even when you have to agree to disagree. So the stakes are high. And when you let your need to be right overshadow the need to have a relationship with your big or parent, the stakes are really high. So don't allow that to happen. Boundaries can keep things safe and healthy, but hopefully learning to disagree in a constructive manner on both sides can make for a relationship that honors everyone's right to their own opinion about their own life. So, Kate, any parting thoughts about disagreements and apologies that you would like to add?
For sure. I think it's important just to remember that disagreements are bound to happen at all levels, the little disagreements and the big ones as well. But just kind of work through them, figure out what works for you and your relationship. Again, like we always say, each kid and each parent is different. So figure out what works for them. Just be receptive to everybody's opinions. And at the end of the day, just remember you only get one set of parents and you only get one set of kids. So, do what you can to hold on tight to that relationship. And just remember, kind of like you said, peace is more important than being right. So that is really everything I've got to say. Do you have anything else, Mom?
No, go ahead and wind her up.
Perfect. All right. Well, that is the wrap for this episode of Raising Bigs. We thank you all for listening today. We hope you found some takeaways, a fresh perspective, and maybe even an action step or two in this episode. Above it all, we hope it opens an opportunity for open conversation between bigs and their parents to discuss everything going on in their life, and specifically in this episode, disagreements and apologies. We are definitely not experts, but we can authentically share what we're learning in hopes of making the path a little bit easier for all those who are listening. You can find this podcast on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and on YouTube. Please subscribe and share with those in your circle who you think might benefit from hearing it. A new episode is released on all three of those platforms every single week.
You can also visit my life coach website at marcyhawkinson.com or email me at lifecoachmarcy@gmail.com. I am also on Facebook at Life Coach Marcy and Instagram at life_coach_Marcy. Where can our listeners find you, Cade?
My handle across all social media platforms is at @DCadeBerrigan. That's where you can find me on any social media. The best way to contact us, whether you want to give us feedback, ask a question, or just reach out to us, is to DM either one of us on social media or to reach out on the Contact Me page on my mom's website. Again, that is marcyhawkinson.com. We appreciate any feedback, topic ideas, or questions that you may have and would like to share. We will see you next time on the next episode of Raising Bigs.
Thanks, Cade.
Bye.